But yeah, St. Pauli versus Union Berlin. Two teams in the bottom half of the table that, have struggled this year, but two teams that won on the last match day. And with that, this sets up a really interesting fixture, doesn't it, Stefan?
Yeah, absolutely does. It's more or less a 6-pointer between two teams who will be desperate to pick up a win from this game. I think it's a really fascinating match because, as we were just saying before we started recording, it's a really difficult one to predict because St. Pauli have typically been better away from home, but are obviously the hosts in this game, and Union Berlin are typically better at home, but are obviously away from home here. And Union Berlin have brought a new head coach in Stefan Baumgart, who I wrote a newsletter on a couple of weeks ago. I'm not terribly optimistic about his chances at Union Berlin. Having said that, they both picked up somewhat unexpected wins. St. Pauli beat a Heidenheim team that looked like they're kind of resurgent after the winter break. Union Berlin beat Mainz 2-1 as well. And I just think it's going to be a really fascinating match. I'm really, really intrigued to see if St. Pauli can pick up 6 points here because, people will probably look at that the table, and for anyone who isn't looking at a table, they might be, driving around in a car listening to this or out jogging or whatever. St. Pauli are bottom of the Bundesliga for points won at home this season. They've picked up 5 from 8 games, only 1 win. They've only scored 3 goals, which obviously is pretty hopeless. But I was kind of looking at the stats behind their home form, and I think it's maybe worth kind of bearing in mind maybe how unlucky they've been at home. And I'll just quickly kind of go through well, they're eight home games so far, and this might seem a little tedious, but just bear with me. So if you look at how many goals they've scored and conceded compared to the XG in these games, I think it points to maybe St. Pauli being a little unfortunate. I'll give you an example. For example, in the Heidenheim game, their first home game of the season, the XG was 1.16 to 1.17, so the XG difference was 0.01. Heidenheim won 2-0. In the second home game against RB Leipzig, the XG was 1.67 to Union Berlin and 0.84 to Leipzig. Ended 0-0. Again, still no goals from Union Berlin. St. Pauli. The third home game against Mainz, which they lost 3-0, their XG was 0.81 to Mainz's 1.3. So again, very little in it, but 3 goals to nothing. Against Wolfsburg, 0-0 draw. 0.73 to 0.94, so very little in it again, but still no goal. Against Bayern Munich, they created absolutely nothing, so fair enough, they lost that game 1-0. They then beat Holstein Kiel 3-1, but in these kind of last 2 home games are really interesting. They lose 2-0 to Werder Bremen, even though the XG in that game was 0.52 to St. Pauli and 0.9 to Werder Bremen. Again, very little in it. And then in the very last home game against Eintracht Frankfurt, which they lost 1-0, their XG was 2.55 to Frankfurt's 2.24. So unless anyone was sitting there writing all those numbers down as I was talking, they're probably thinking, Stefan, you've just riddled off a load of gobbledygook. What sense am I supposed to make from that? I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that their home games have been extremely tight in terms of the chances they create and the chances they let their opponents create. And in a lot of these games, they probably should have scored goals, especially that Frankfurt game, which I watched because we all expected it to be Omar Marmoush's last game at Frankfurt. Frankfurt get a goal, but it was a game, and I remember saying this in our subscriber chat, I was like, it's only a matter of time before St. Pauli score here. It's only a matter of time. They've created so many chances, and sure enough, they didn't manage to do that. So I think they've maybe been a little hard luck, a little unfortunate, if you will, at home. And I'd be really intrigued to see if they can do something against St. Pauli, against Union Berlin, because I don't really rate Union Berlin by any chance. Stefan Baumgart hasn't been outstanding by any means. I'm not a huge fan of his in terms of thinking, he's obviously got quite a big reputation. He's quite big personality. He obviously has his fans from certain clubs he's coached that, but that Mainz win aside, I'm just not entirely sure there's a huge amount that St. Pauli should be fearing here and going into this game. And it's a match that I think they'll not only want to win because they need all 3 points, but it's also a match where they want to get that kind of monkey off their back in terms of turning around that really, really, really unfortunate home form.
Yeah, I'm actually just looking at the Zweite Bundesliga table, home table from last year. And, St. Pauli were first with 11 wins, 5 draws, and 1 loss, 38 points, 2 points more than the other team in Hamburg. May have heard of them, Hamburg SV. Which makes it so curious that this year their home form is so terrible, because the home form last year was the backbone of them reaching promotion, and that's why I'm actually quite optimistic for St. Pauli to stay in the Bundesliga, because sooner or later that's going to come back to the forefront, right? Sooner or later they're going to regain their form, because just to give you an example, the previous year on the home form, when you go by home form, then too, St. Pauli didn't manage to get promoted, but they still were sixth in the Bundesliga, in the Zweite Bundesliga standings. So again, it's not usually it's the home stadium where they get most of their points. Is the point that I'm trying to make here? So it's just really curious that this year that's something that's completely kind of fallen by the wayside for them. I maybe it's the opponents that they have faced. Maybe it's just also making the jump to the Bundesliga and the pressure that comes with that. But what I find most curious about
as well,
new head coach, right, Blessing. Yep. But even back in the day, when St. Pauli have been in the Bundesliga in the past, it usually was not the home form that did them in. It was usually being on the road.
Just one more last thing on that, Manu, because I was checking some stats as well before, as you were talking there. I checked their expected points, which I know sounds like a made-up metric. In many ways, it is a made-up metric, but it's some stats websites take the XG in games and kind of award that to the game and see how many points the team should have picked up. And for St. Pauli, so far this season, they should have picked up 10 points at home as opposed to the 5 they've currently got. So had they got those extra 5 points, they would be sitting in the table 12th above Augsburg and just below Gladbach with 23 points, which, sorry, I tell a lie, they'd be sitting joint level with Augsburg, above them on goal difference, I suppose, with 22 points, which I think would completely change the narrative around St. Pauli's season. If I know it's only 5 points and only a couple extra positions above the table, but I think that would completely change the narrative around them right now. And this idea that they're really struggling. Now they are, don't get me wrong, they absolutely are struggling. But I think you're right. I think that there's a good chance that they could kind of trend upwards in the second half of the season if they can get that home form nailed down.
Well, especially in this weekend, and as you said, a lot of Union Berlin fans are not going to like to hear this, but it's not like Union Berlin are a powerhouse on the road, right? So, and I know they won last weekend against Mainz, a really good Mainz team. We're going to talk about Mainz and Stuttgart later on the show, but I'm still not sold 100% by this Stefan Baumgart thing, Stefan. I just not. I just felt like it was a gut reaction hire, and those don't always work out really well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrote a piece for the website. Wasn't last weekend, I guess it was the week before, so just when he was appointed.
Yeah.
And, obviously taking a look at what he's done in the past and his record and why they went to pick him up. And a kind of ironic twist, I think Union Berlin kind of decided to jump the shark, if you will, in terms of trying to make a managerial appointment, because they saw that Bochum had made a big change. They saw that Hoffenheim had made a managerial change. They saw both those clubs in their rearview mirror. Obviously, Bochum has started picking up points under Dieter Hecking. You could certainly argue that Hoffenheim's form has been just as mixed under their new head coach, but they did win, I guess, last weekend. So both those clubs have been kind of picking up more points than they did in the first half of the season. Union Berlin decided to do the same thing. Whether they actually had a long-term plan in mind and thought Stefan Baumgart was the best guy to implement that, or they just kind of looked at who they could convince to join the club at this point of the season, and the only person that would be interested is the guy who was recently sacked by Hamburg and played for the club 20 years ago when they were in the 3rd or 4th division, is something that we'll have to maybe wait for the history book about Union Berlin to be written in terms of getting the answer to that question. But Yeah, he's come in. I was skeptical at the time because he obviously plays a certain brand of football. It's your very kind
Hmm.
of boilerplate, gegenpressing style of football. Um, Maybe works well if you're a competent mid-table team where you can beat the teams below you and you can maybe cause a few upsets. And to an extent, it maybe reverts back to the kind of football that the club obviously played once upon a time under Urs Fischer. When they were kind of doing remarkably well. I just think the squad's nowhere near as good as it was back then. I don't think they have anywhere near the depth, which I think was the real secret weapon back then as well. And I don't think Baumgart is Urs Fischer by any means. So that was obviously shown in their 2-0 defeat to Heidenheim, and then lost 2-0 to Augsburg. Two teams right there alongside Union Berlin at the bottom of the table. And had it not been for that 2-1 win against Mainz, which really was quite the upset, I think Baumgart could have been looking at, or Union Berlin could have been looking at potentially hiring their third head coach of the season. But, we don't want to kind of completely count him out just yet. He's obviously got a point to prove. And I guess we'll just see what happens, Manu. But it's going to be a tricky one for them against St Pauli because I haven't really seen any discernible change in tactics, or not in terms of tactics, but like uptick in form or performances from Union Berlin. And it's going to take a mammoth task because his predecessor, Svensson, was the complete opposite. He was a very defensive, rigid, counter-attacking style. And Union Berlin, the first half of the season, I thought did a pretty decent job of kind of picking up points and scraping points off bigger teams when they came to play them in Berlin. But Union Berlin have decided to just completely turn that on its head, bringing a new guy who's going to wipe the slate clean and see if he can fix things before the end of the season. And maybe it's just me being old cynical Steph, I guess, which I am. But I'm wary of this actually working for them.
Yeah, I thought it was a bad decision to get rid of Bo Svensson. I maintain that he's an excellent head coach, and I think he would have worked this out in the medium term. And I'm not sure if Stefan Baumgart's football is going to break down a defense that is the second best in the Bundesliga, right? So yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things where I feel like football clubs do really well when they make decisions. Not necessarily 100% analytics, but if analytics do play a role, and whether if they make intelligence decisions that are based on something fundamental, and they usually do poorly when they run on gut instinct. And I think Union Berlin right now are poorly run on gut instinct. This was a decision where I think they realized Stefan Baumgart was available. He was a hero of the club back in the day. He's this East German guy, and so they're like, oh yeah, he's a perfect fit for this club, without actually looking at the way he plays football. Like, his character, from a characteristic perspective, he's a perfect fit, but his football isn't. So these two things, if they don't gel with one another, I think you have a huge issue. I actually think Hamburger's Foul fell into a similar trap. They realized that, oh yeah, his football is actually perfect to get you promoted. But then they forgot that also Stefan Baumgart was like a zero fit for a club like HSV, right? This is like the reverse. Like, from a character, it's a fit, but from football perspective, it's not. So, and those things I think always get you in trouble sooner rather than later.